Good evening, everyone, and welcome to this discussion series on AI for Law and Justice. I'm Chitra Narayan, and I teach at the Daksha Fellowship in the Sai University. This discussion series was initially conceived as a part of classroom discussions in the Daksha Fellowship. And over time, we realized that as we discussed with Agami and OpenAI on how we could best have these discussions, we realized that it would make sense to open these discussions to all students, to academicians, and to lawyers who would be interested in this space. And so we have this set of discussions. Our first discussion today is on setting out the landscape in AI in law and justice, where we discuss endeavors and initiatives that are made in this space. Our second discussion session will be on the 24th of September, this Friday, between 5 and 7 p.m. again, where we will discuss issues relating to AI in the justice space. We have an overbearing sort of sense of, pendency of cases in courts, delays, and access to courts. And we look at, initiatives and efforts, including AI, ODR as, panacea, which will help us resolve this. In that session, we hope to discuss how this will work as far as justice is concerned. Our third session is particularly for students. That is on the 2nd of October, again, between 5 and 7 p.m., where we look at opportunities in AI for students, what the future holds, what are careers, and where things will go from here. So welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining the session, and a big thank you to the panelists, to Agami and to OpenAI for working together on this. Sachin, over to you.
Thank you, Chitra, for setting the stage. A little bit, so I'm here on behalf of OpenAI. OpenAI is a mission by many organizations, technologists, law schools, civil sector organizations, public innovators, to really come together and create the open resources that we need to take charge of our AI destiny in India, insofar as law and justice is concerned. A lot of the conversations around AI in law and justice have been these consequence conversations. And what I mean by that is AI is going to happen, and what's going to happen to us? How will AI impact lawyers? What does AI mean for judgments? So the conversation has been framed as a conversation of AI is a kind of bimari, and is it going to be good or bad? It's ye hoga kya? Hamara kya hoga? And it is that framing has taken away our agency, that we get to create the kind of AI that we want in our country. We get to shape it bit of data by data, and that students in India have always had an integral role in advancing new fields, and they must have an integral role in advancing this field. So that's what the OpenAI mission is all about, creating the open data resources, open technology resources to make sure that we can retain a grip on our AI destiny. This collaboration, this wonderful collaboration with Sai University and the Daksha Fellowship, is our effort to say that we can't approach this without first making it as digestible as possible, which is what is this AI impact on law and justice? What does it mean? And there are friends here who will say, let's use the term machine learning, not AI. There are friends who will say, what's the difference between the two? How does it really impact? I mean, instead of running helter-skelter to AI judges, because that's a nice article that can be written, can we first talk about the basics and help everybody understand, what is the real implication? And of course, there are, not to trivialize it, there are huge implications. It is maybe the most relevant technological change along with bioengineering of this century. So given all that, this is probably a conversation we must be having, and I'm glad we're having it for students, with students. Thank you all for being a part of this, and looking forward to these three series. You're a wonderful group. And I have the privilege of handing over to my friend and the wonderful moderator for today, Srijoni Sen. Srijoni, just a very brief introduction. I can't think of anyone better because even though Srijoni's designation says assistant professor NLSIU, little people don't realize that she's done consulting, research, entrepreneurship, academics. So she's really cycling through all these different things. And next is, going with Jeffrey Bezos to space. But she's done it all. She's doing many of these things, which also puts her in a great position to look at it broadly and not get tied down to only one dimension of AI. So she has with her today, leading entrepreneur, leading technologist, leading researchers. She has that wonderful group today to explore together what is the state of AI for law and justice in India. Srijoni, over to you.
Thank you, Sachin, and welcome everyone. It's my pleasure to moderate the session today, and we have a really exciting and diverse series of panelists as well. As this is the first session, and as Sachin mentioned, because AI means a lot of different things to a lot of different people. Even when AI and justice is being mentioned, people's minds are going to a specific aspect that they may be interested in, whether it's the building of the technology, whether it's its impact on the profession, its impact on the court system, its impact on the markets. So different people are thinking about into these perspectives and say, what does the big picture look like? And within that big picture, how can we all intervene and shape the kind of AI for justice that we really want to see? So that's kind of the goal for today. When we were conceptualizing this panel, we also thought it was important to understand kind of three layers when we talk about AI for justice, and the panelists here can speak to each one of them in a deeper sense. So first, there is kind of the big picture for the applications or the impact of AI in the justice sector itself. But within that, a lot of work has to happen, and with different people and initiatives focusing on different parts of the puzzle. The first being the foundations and the infrastructure layer for artificial intelligence. That actually means having the core components ready. This could mean large data sets, this could mean open benchmarking systems, but a lot of those layers that may not be easily visible to consumers or easily visible to the legal profession have to be in place and have to be in place as Indian infrastructure that exists in this space. And that's one of the first themes that we'll explore. Once those AI foundational infrastructural elements are available, that means many more people can participate in building key building blocks that are meant for the law and justice sector. These could be things like judgment summarization, better search functions, better kind of analysis of large court data sets. But those kinds of algorithms and applications happen at the second layer. And at the third layer is the part that's most visible to the consumer, to litigants, judges, lawyers, etc., who will look at the eventual app, the eventual court system processing, the eventual research paper that builds on all of this. But it's really important that there are people looking at, understanding, and participating in every layer. And here are an amazing set of people today to speak to each one. And I'll start first with Vaidehi Mishra. I can quickly introduce her and then ask her to talk about this big picture really. Vaidehi is a research fellow with the Vidhi Center who works in the area of judicial reform. She has an affinity for large data sets and technology-informed policymaking, and currently working on issues surrounding judicial transparency and the streamlining of dispute resolution. She's recently co-authored a strategy paper on this very issue. And so, Vaidehi, if we could invite you to talk about the big picture for responsible AI in the judiciary and where you think some of our priorities should be.
Yeah, thanks, Srijoni, and thank you for having me here. And, when we talk about sort of laying the land, there's just so much that can be said, So I was thinking about how to maybe structure these 7 minutes. And so I think the first sort of input that I can give, is what India's status, the Indian judiciary status is vis-a-vis AI. And then maybe the second I can add on is on what are the maybe possibilities that can be integrated within the Indian judiciary, right? Like, which is accessible. And then third, if there is still some time, then what are maybe like some of the lessons, from, jurisdictions outside India that have included AI within their justice systems? What would they look like? So the context in India really dates. I mean, it would be really unfair to talk about AI without really starting from the eCourts project, which really is the start of, any sort of technological innovation in India. So this really started from 2005 when the eCourts project, I mean, when a committee was constituted, then the e-committee was set up by the Supreme Court. Then there was phase one of the eCourts project, which was really, like you were mentioning, setting up the technological infrastructure, just getting computers, getting LAN, getting like broadband, see, so sort of really basic hardware requirements. And then that sort of improved into phase two of the eCourts project, where, there were sort of more technological innovation. Say, for instance, there was the inclusion of, the establishment of the eCourts website, which has really transformed the manner in which people access judicial information, as in, getting case information, getting, information for research purposes. There is also the setting up of the NJDG, which is the National Judicial Data Grid, which really provides, I mean, I come as a researcher, so I understand the value of just having NJDG, because I mean, all our research really is, I mean, to whatever extent it can be, data driven. It's coming from available data sets that's, that are publicly available. And I mean, a conversation on the need for availability of data sets is like, it can be a 7-minute session in itself, like a 1-hour session on just talking about how important data sets are. But to go back to, the eCourts project, there is, of course, NJDG. There are also setting up of sort of more, better tools, like, say, for instance, NSTEP, which is supposed to expedite, summons delivery. There are also VC facilities. I mean, the reason I'm talking about all of this is because we have to recognize the status in India. So we can't really move from 0 to 100 in a day. And recognition of where India is set up today is extremely important in understanding the kind of AI solutions we can integrate in the short term, in the long term, in the longer term, right? And so within India, I think if we have to talk, so there may be 4 initiatives that we can say AI has, been integrated. The first is virtual courts for settling traffic related offenses. So this is the idea of a robot judge. I mean, where there are traffic violations that are inputted on this. You can go online, you can pay. The information comes on your mobile phone. You can take the link. You can pay through UPI. You don't have to go to a court where otherwise summons would be issued with physical presence. So this is one sort of tool of AI. The second is Suvas, which is a translation tool that has been introduced by the Supreme Court, that uses ML processing to translate judgments. And this is extremely complicated, as in having judgments as PDFs or machine readable format seems like, such an easy transition, but the amount of resources it takes from, just converting this technology and accessing this is immense. So Suvas is one of the attempts that the Supreme Court E-Committee has been making. And the Supreme Court has also set up a Supreme Court AI committee, which was headed by Justice Nageshwar Rao, to, help, integrate AI within India. And Suvas has now, the attempt is to translate 9 vernacular languages: Marathi, Hindi, Kannada, Tamil, I mean, from English to these vernacular languages and then back. There is also another tool that has been introduced, which is Supace, which is a data mining tool. So it is to help judges sort of mine, case law, do research, and then project like case progress. So this is still in the works. And there is another tool, as in it's not really identified as a tool, but there are projects that are being piloted for making courts paperless. So Justice Chandrachud, who is the E-Committee chairperson, he's sort of spoken about it in public, where it's like you're talking about paperless courts, e-filing of cases, removing the redundancy of duplication. When I recognize that when I'm talking about all of this doesn't seem really like, high funda, super cool, what are the new things that AI is doing? But I think it's really extremely important to situate the whole discussion with these realities, right? And I think that's a very critical element of even starting this discussion. And so, which is one of the reasons why I was talking about data cops, like, data availability. And I'm sure there are other people who'd be also like driven to talk about it. So I'll let that be. But one of the other things I also wanted to talk about was just how implementation can happen. Like there are like a few big operational and implementation challenges that are present today. The first is really like, acceptance of AI can only come through long-term behavioral change. And we have seen that with all sort of technological innovations. I mean, stakeholders are not going to adopt, new innovation in legal tech without having greater accessibility and familiarity with like UPI, for instance, opening Netflix and then realizing that you need to change a couple of, you need to type differently, for instance. So these are really everyday changes that individuals need to make, and that will to some extent determine the speed of acceptability. It really can't be impetuses, like the impetus cannot be to catapult it like, really expeditedly. And we also have to recognize that even inclusion of AI is happening in a country where the digital divide is very immense. And like adopting these technologies, and there are so many examples that I can give of like different countries and the tools that they're adopting and how they're expediting. Like they're doing work that, would have otherwise taken 144 days in like 2 hours. But the context in India really is of like this huge, immense digital divide, which continues to keep expanding with more technological innovation. So with the inclusion of AI and the real complexities that in some AI can introduce, I think that is something that really needs to be taken under consideration when implementing and even thinking about AI. It really can't be a question of, oh, we'll implement it in an accessible fashion. We really have to think about how we can think about these solutions in a manner that it can really reduce the divide. Can it be done through WhatsApp? How is the manner in which this can be introduced to citizens? And the other sort of thing to think about in terms of AI in India is to not think about solutions absolutely new. It's not only about absolutely new solutions that are path breaking, but identifying current systems that exist and integrating solutions within them. As in, how can we endorse current solutions? Say, for instance, I'd mentioned NSTEP, which is this summons tool, which is to expedite summons delivery. How can we make that better? There is a case management system that exists in the Bombay High Courts, which is used for scheduling. And if AI is to be integrated, how can that system be taken and made better? What are the amendments that need to be made in order to make that better? So sort of this is the context that I want to leave with. I've sort of done my time of the 7 minutes, and I'm happy to talk about one critical aspect, I mean, at some point, which is really of maybe some of the examples that have been used across the globe, especially when it comes to predictive justice, that, and the skepticism that should come along with that. So I'll sort of leave it there. Thanks.
Thank you, Vedi. That was a good reality check to start with, and I might have a couple of follow-up questions on that as well later on. But, I think both of us now have mentioned the importance of the core building blocks, the need for the infrastructure to be in place, and no one better than Vivek to comment on that. So I'll turn to him next. Vivek is the chief AI evangelist at Ekstep Foundation, and he led Project Suvas, which is a machine-assisted translation tool for artificial intelligence in the judicial domain, and is currently also now working on open NLP benchmarking, which I will leave him to explain as well. Vivek, what do you think AI for justice in India needs at this moment, first of all? You're on mute.
Thanks, Srijoni, and thank you for inviting me to this panel. And I think the thing that we, when we look at AI, I mean, AI is a buzzword. People use it for all kinds of things, and I think, I think one of the most, and I'm going to actually be talking about one of the buzzwords, and I'm trying to demystify it a little bit. Right? We always say that data is really the basis on which we can do meaningful AI, and that is, we say data is the oil of whatever. There are so many of those kinds of statements. And what does that mean? And I think that and what does that mean? And I think that's something that. So one of the things that people don't realize today, everybody talks about AI. But I think the fact about the matter is AI as a field started like maybe in the 1980s. And for almost 30 years, nothing happened in AI. And actually, there are a lot of people were saying that it's a dead field. But what really happened at that time, and around 2010, what really happened was two things happened. One was that the amount of data that people had increased dramatically, and the compute capability improved dramatically. And the very same techniques that people have used, which the AI techniques that have been thought about 30 years ago, which weren't actually giving results, which were comparable to using kind of traditional computer methods, which I want to separate from AI. Actually, suddenly AI-based methods started giving results which were comparable. And one of the areas, and I think that where things have happened is that, like, for example, one of the areas where it was actually in image recognition, that there was actually a benchmark of data known as ImageNet, and it was this data which actually drove, image recognition in AI, to the extent that probably in the year 2015, computers can actually look at an image and probably better tell you what things are there than actually humans. And that's clearly true in terms of, and now the interesting part was, while image processing made a lot of progress in the early times, probably in 2017-18 was the first time that actually NLP, which is probably the core for actually doing AI in things where there's a lot of text involved, and I mean, of course, there are things like speech recognition and other things that are there, which actually are a combination of things that are there. But in about 2017-18, for the first time, there was actually a breakthrough again, and it is also related to how a large amount of data could be used to train AI models. And the second part which I want to see is that progress has been related to the availability of data sets. So AI progress has been very uneven in the world. So where good data sets have appeared, there is dramatic progress. And there's another field where maybe AI could have had an impact, but the impact is very limited because of the lack of availability of data sets and lack of availability of benchmarks. Okay, and benchmarks, I'd like to define. Benchmarks is basically defined as something where you think, and the various basically, and people build various systems, and typically in AI, you say they build models, and then you see what is the performance of this model against this data set. And wherever this competition has existed, that is basically significant data sets have existed, well-defined benchmarks have existed, there has been dramatic progress in AI to solve that problem. So in fact, the game in AI actually is, where do the data sets exist? Because that's where those are the problems that are actually being solved. And then, are there ways to actually measure progress in a systematic manner? That's the other part. So that's where basically data sets and benchmarks. Now so I think the point about it is, at least, if you look at things like access to raw data sets from the Indian judiciary is improving. People, the court judgments and other papers are beginning to become available. That's a very raw data that's there, which again can absolutely be used to do various things. And then there are many researchers, and I'm sure others are going to talk about it, who've taken these data sets and built certain kind of structured data on top of them to basically to try and answer some kinds of questions. Now, what we want to do, and I think that and I'm also associated with the OpenAI initiative, but the intent is that there are obviously these two kinds of things. There are the raw data sets, and there are the cases where there is a small research group which is actually trying to painstakingly get some structured data out of something. But we want to actually create a scenario where we can broad base this whole thing. So the intent is to actually get a way by which I can get students and law students and maybe even not law students to actually kind of help annotate and create data in a way that actually can dramatically increase the kinds of data that are available in this space, and then use that data sets to create benchmarks which drive innovation. And again, the important thing is most of the cases where AI has been extremely successful is where data has been open and data has been freely shared. And I think that is something that is, again, which is very important to be, especially if we want AI to solve our problems as opposed to Google's problems. We need to actually create the data sets that would be used for these kinds of things. So that's part of so the intent is to actually try and see how are various methods of actually trying and creating data sets and then building benchmarks. And the other part, one of the other parts, which is true in AI, which is, and I'm here talking more from as a technical researcher, is the question is that many of these algorithms are actually, and newer algorithms are available in open source, and you actually need to train those algorithms on your data, and that's actually the key thing that you need to be able to do. And so therefore, and new algorithms are coming literally every week. We are actually getting people is doing something interesting and exciting, but the problem they are solving typically relates to where. So the sets and you can actually make significant progress. Well, and I think is that while still a very long way to go, and we have to look at this as a long-term kind of a thing, because and the way you deal with the long-term thing is to actually create meaningful data sets, make them open, develop baseline algorithms that do it, and let somebody beat your algorithm. That's what the game is. And have kind of defined ways of measuring progress. And if we can actually do something like that, we can not only take advantage of AI, make AI solve our problems that we care about in our space, and be a leader in the world. I mean, that's really in terms of trying to solve these things. So, I mean, I'll kind of limit my comments in this first round to this, and back to you, Srijani.
Thank you, Vivek. I think the mention of open data sets, now we'll move to someone who has tackled some of these data sets and tried to wrangle it to produce useful insights. This is Devendra Damle. Devendra is a research fellow at NIPFP and has used machine learning and NLP techniques to analyze vast amounts of litigation data to understand the design of the law. He currently leads the land and property rights team in the Macrofinance Group. Devendra, first-hand experience with these data sets, and do you think all the hype of NLP techniques, etc., is producing measurably better outcomes in the kind of work that you do?
Thanks, Srijani. That's a substantial question to tackle, and thanks to the organizers for having me here. So let me start with the second part on whether there are any measurable outcomes. We have to sort of approach the whole thing with a little bit of caution, and we have to set expectations correctly on what we are talking about here. So do we have some tools to, for instance, do reliable translations? We are getting somewhere over there. Do we have something that can reliably crunch a diverse set of legal documents to give us, say, precise insights about them? I think we are a little further away from there. So let me take a step back on what I've been struggling with, and I think this will sort of bridge the things that Vaidehi mentioned and what Vivek mentioned. So I'm a policy researcher. My interest primarily is in studying the law and its implementation. So what, in an ideal world, I would like to do is take the tools that somebody like Vivek develops, adapt them for whatever study I am doing, and then put out a research output, either in the form of recommendations on how some law needs to be changed because something is not working well, or say something like how does the administration of an agency need to be changed because there is something wrong with how it is doing things. So to do something like that, there are some intermediate steps which can become useful for multiple people. So for a researcher like me, for instance, if I'm looking at, let's take, for example, the tax tribunal, the income tax appellate tribunal. I am interested in what kinds of cases are filed there, what kinds of violations it sees and how it typically rules on them, who are the people who are coming up as parties and litigants. So somebody like me will take this and look at, oh, these are the provisions of the law which lead to a lot of problems, and then we should think about how to change them. Or for that matter, I would say these are the provisions of the law which set up bad incentives for certain departments, and that leads to problems for everybody around. For a private party, say somebody like Pulkit, the solution that they build on top of this information is how can a company make some strategic decisions or risk management strategies based on how they expect this litigation to go. The court itself can use the same information to decide, oh, how many resources do I need? What kind of judge strength do I need? How many benches do I need? Where are these distributed? Where are the issues coming from? So what we are sort of working on right now is trying to bridge these two. I mean, work is happening everywhere, but this is the bridge that policymakers are sort of trying to build. And in order to get from what Vivek is doing to what Vaidehi was talking about, which is the adoption of AI tools by the system itself, by the judiciary to do its own research for resource allocation and so on, some intrepid policy researchers have to putter around and come up with these results to show what is possible, and also to set up what the prerequisites are to do something like this. So I want to point to one particular point that Vaidehi mentioned, which is the digitization that the court system has done, and Justice Chandrachud's push towards paperless digital filings. So this is incredibly important. What we have right now effectively is a paper-based process with an overlay of computerization. The process itself is not digital. So if I want to run thousands of judgments through my model to produce something, I have to go through a fairly banal and frustrating process of converting a PDF to text and making sure that there is some pre-processing to remove spacing, this, that. Then there is the second order problem, which is that there is no standardization in the bookkeeping itself and in the text itself, in the text of the judgment. So there is no easy way to identify which part are the facts of the case, which part are the arguments, which part are the rulings. So if you want to build any sophisticated system on top of this, you have to build all of these components to distinguish between these parts, or you have to convince the system that is producing this information to supply it in a structured format so that it can be used for something like this. So here we run into some problems of incentives and stakeholders, like who the stakeholders are. Sorry, just a second, my screen conked off. Right, so here we run into two issues which are of incentives to do this and of who are the people who are trying to implement all of this and who are the users. So if we look at the second one first, judges and court staff are the people who are generating this data. The people who are designing the system are not really closely connected to this. They will have a user requirement stage and then they'll try to build something on top of that. Somebody like, say, NIC. And then the people who are trying to consume this data on mass scale, people like Vivek and I, we are the third level who are completely unconnected with the design and the data generation part of it. So that leads to a lot of problems. So if there is some way to have a sort of common understanding of what should this data be like, what are the roles of each of the parties in the system, then that would be a great step forward. I'm sorry, I rambled on and I forgot one of the things I was saying. Nevertheless, on the access to data, yeah. So that is the second feature which causes a lot of problems. So if let's say that we can get past all of these issues of the data being unstructured and the availability, that there is a divide, that some states and some places don't provide data as much as some other places. There is, how do I put this? There is still a problem with accessing data in bulk. So there isn't a way where I can go and say, okay, I want all of the cases that went through the courts in Maharashtra, and then I'm going to crunch all of that. So I have to write programs, I have to write scrapers, which have to do that banal task of just going and what effectively is clicking on certain links again and again and clicking on download to create this data set. So those are the three things I think where we need to focus our attention. One is on bulk access to data. The second is figuring out how the courts and the rest of the stakeholders can come to a common understanding of how the data should be supplied. So standards for the data, and then we can think about building AI systems on top of it. So there are different levels and different aspects on which AI can be deployed. So one is like the things that I am doing, which is looking at the judgments and what happens in the case. The second could be you can structure it like a supply chain management problem or an organization function problem, where you're applying AI engines to the functioning of the organization as a whole on how to streamline it. And once you have organized data like that, you can think about it. On one point, generally on the disclosures, yes, there has been progress on putting out data on judgments and orders, but we still don't get the raw material. We don't get filings, for instance, which might be available for Supreme Courts, but we don't have it for the lower courts and the high courts. Now, why is this important? If we want to do some predictive modeling, we can't just take the judgment of the text, because that's where the case is already decided. What is useful is looking at filings and then figuring out how the case is going to go or what is going to happen in the future. So we have to think about which parts of this entire process can be digitized and what data can be safely put out. And of course, here we run into some issues which we are not going to discuss today, but which will, I think, be discussed in the next sessions on privacy and data protection and so on. So I think I'll end my ramble over there and hand it over to the moderator.
Thank you. I think, again, important notes on where we actually are today, but if certain things are in place, then the potential for all of this in the near future. And here's someone to talk about the potential a bit more, to look at the consumer and the market side of this. Someone who's been, again, deep in the weeds of this, but possibly with a more optimistic outlook, is Pulkit Anand. So Pulkit is a serial entrepreneur with extensive experience across airlines, healthcare, and the legal space. And he's now the co-founder of ProVakil, which is an AI-powered solution to streamline legal operations. Uses machine learning in their integrated suite for legal teams. And I have a note here in brackets that says he also doesn't like the word artificial intelligence and prefers machine learning. So perhaps, Pulkit, you could tell us a bit more about that, and also about where do you see the potential for this? What are you excited about in the future?
Right. Thank you so much, Srijoni, for the great introduction. And thank you so much to the organizers for having me as a part of this illustrious panel. I'm really excited and honored to be here with all of you guys. So we have heard some great opening remarks from different sides of the industry, and I'll sort of talk a little bit about coming at it as a founder and an engineer first, right? So having been working on problems for about 11 years in the industry, one thing that I've realized working in legal is, or one thing that has surprised me through my career, is how similar the problem statements start to look if you take your lens a little bit outside, right? I mean, I worked in aviation, I worked in healthcare, I worked in legal, and at a generic level, at a data crunching level, at a getting insights level, the problem statements look uncannily similar across spaces, right? And so that is why I am an excited engineer working in the legal space today, right? This problem has been talked about from a lot of different dimensions. I'd like to add a couple of my takes, right? So I'd like to start by addressing just in terms of how to talk about AI, right? And that is what you mentioned, that I don't like the word AI, I like machine learning. But when I am having a conversation with my team internally about our products and our roadmap, the word machine learning is also banned, right? The word there is pattern matching, right? And wherever you see AI and machine learning show up, if you just replace that in your mind with pattern matching, the sentences would just start to make more sense, right? So if for those folks who had mathematics as a part of their high school education, right? If you remember studying a little bit about statistics, where you used to make regression models with 3 variables, right? Where there was some sales data of 20, 25 items, and you solved a simultaneous equation with 3 variables, and then you came at the answer of what the coefficient has to be, right? You just replace those 3 variables with 3 million variables, right? And that is essentially what machine learning is at the end of the day, right? I mean, of course, there are improved techniques to manage a lot of that, but at the end of it, I like to think of it as a huge regression model, which is about it, right? One thing that Vivek, for example, rightly pointed out, right? What changed in the last decade is the sheer amount of data and the compute power available, right? Finding 3 million coefficients, you need crazy compute for that. Compute is a commodity now, right? Somebody in their dorm room can spin up large GPU VMs on the cloud and start churning data and start building models, right? That is what has changed in the last decade. From a data or AI perspective, in terms of the opportunities within legal, right? The conversation so far has touched upon it from a dispute resolution or a litigation point of view, from a judgments or an order point of view. Our take is slightly different, right? And again, containing ourselves in the scope of legal, right? For us, legal is a broader term which involves not only dispute resolution, but it also involves intellectual property. It also involves contracts getting signed between different parties. It also involves compliances and so on, right? From an AI perspective, and drawing back to what I was mentioning earlier, that you replace machine learning with pattern matching. Wherever there is going to be a large amount of data, and with legal, that data looks like large amounts of text data, right? You will be able to do great pattern matching to identify themes and trends using your NLP techniques, right? Natural language processing, being able to discretize that information and make it useful for the machine to understand, right? Legal lends itself very well to that use case. And any dimension of legal that I have touched upon in the last 5-6 years has troves and troves of text data in it, right? And so that is what needs to be mined, and that is what needs to be pattern matched, and that is what can drive a lot of value and innovation on top of whatever is happening within legal, right? Now, so I'll give you a small example, right? And we work with a lot of lawyers, law firms, large enterprise companies across different industries in the country. A lot of law firms have a large trademark portfolio that they manage for their customers, right? So for example, let's say I'm a big law firm. I would have, let's say, 50 to 100 clients. Each of those clients would have, let's say, 100 trademarks. So a particular law firm, let's say, is managing anywhere between 500 to 1,000 trademarks, right? Now, as a part of their services, you're also engaged with the client to help them protect the intellectual property, which is their logos or the brands that they have registered, right? Now, for legal students and law professionals familiar with the trademark filing process, the registry would publish a journal containing about 5,000 to 10,000 marks every Monday at noon, right? And if you walk into any of the trademark managing law firms on Monday at noon, you will find 15 associates with that journal trying to pattern match 10,000 marks published on that journal against the 1,000 trademarks that they're managing for their clients, and trying to figure out which of these marks could be potentially infringing, right? And I cite this example as a response to all of those questions which ask, is AI or ML a threat to the legal profession, or what would the lawyers do? This is something that the lawyers are doing today, and I don't think any lawyer deserves to do it, right? Forget about how banal or mundane that is. This kind of a thing is better left to machines, right? And so this is an example of where systems and technologies can really swoop in to provide a leapfrog assistance in the work that was already happening, but taking the banal and the mundanity out of a lawyer's work so that they can focus on more important things, right? And this past statement that I have made is generally true for technology over the last 150 years of our existence, right? Or rather, the last 5,000 years, right? Starting from the time when mankind discovered fire, right? This statement would be true for any form of technology, right? So I think that is a good framework to think about the potential and the opportunity that we have with AI or machine learning or pattern matching systems, or however you want to put it, right? One point that I would like to add as closing remarks to the note is, as an entrepreneur, as somebody who's building a startup in the legal tech space and having worked in technology for over 10 years now, I do appreciate and understand the importance of open systems, right? Open systems allow different kinds of stakeholders to build value on top of a value chain, right? So for example, the e-court system, for example, right? The e-court system has a lot of benefits for research, for a lot of different stakeholders, but a company like ProVakil, among others, were able to also build on top of the e-court systems and provide a really valuable system working with large enterprises and large law firms. That problem statement is something that the government or the court system should not be required to solve, right? A good example, and it was already mentioned before in one of the opening remarks, is UPI, for example, right? Whereas the objective of UPI is exchange of transaction information between different connected financial institutions in the country and soon the world, right? So for those of you who have been keeping a close eye on the news, you will soon be able to send money to Singapore as a pilot to a phone number powered by the UPI network, right? And that demonstrates the sheer power of an open system where people can swoop in, connect to a network and build on top of it to unlock value, right? I'm sure or I'm almost sure that sending payments to Singapore was not one of the opening objectives of when UPI was being framed, right? So, for example, UPI has powered a lot of billing systems, a lot of invoice management systems, a lot of payment reconciliation systems. There are possibly 2 or 3 unicorns in that space that have only been possible because UPI exists and people are building on top of it, right? So, open systems definitely allow people to build on top of it, and keeping those open systems simple, right? As framers of an open system, there is no way one organization can think of all the potential use cases that this network has to solve, right? You have to leave it to the better judgment of the stakeholders in the system, who, if provided an open system, will definitely figure out a way to build on top of it, right? I mean, ProVakil, among others, right? ProVakil is not the only company in this space. There are a lot of people who are doing bigger, better things than ProVakil. Even in the absence of a really robust open data system in legal, these companies are thriving, right? So just imagine the kind of potential that can get unlocked, and the kind of access that can open if there is a common framework which allows people to build on top of open systems, right? So with that, I'll hand it over back to you, Srijani. Those were my opening remarks.
Thank you, Pulkit. I think particularly your examples brought a lot of this to light. Thank you, everyone who's also put your questions on chat. We'll take some of these up now. And everyone else also, please feel free to put your questions on chat as we go into this kind of next round. I'm seeing a lot of questions, and some of these were somewhat addressed as the speakers spoke, but on some of what we can expect to see in AI in the judiciary in kind of the medium term, right? And why AI at all, I think, is a question if the panelists could reflect on. At OpenAI, we see some areas which we're excited about, things that will give a reason and kind of provide a basis for the use of AI in a way that's suitable to Indian contexts. And from a really big picture, we also do have a justice system that is not originally designed keeping a billion strong population in mind, keeping the justice needs or dispute resolution needs of people in mind. So whether it's the formal court system or whether it's a contract between two parties and a dispute around it, or whether it's something that people will not even think of bringing to the traditional legal system because the legal system will not be able to deliver those results, but is still a dispute resolution need of people. The size of the problem is such that you need suitable technological assistance to actually address the needs of the citizens in this sector. And that's why I think we're speaking about AI in the justice system at all. And some examples of this, which our speakers have also mentioned, is of course one around the problem of pendency in courts. So insights into the court system, better procedures, better process automation, and the potential for AI/ML techniques or technological interventions in that space is kind of area number one for us. The second, which I think a few people also mentioned on chat, is ODR, and perhaps some of the panelists could speak to that. The third is free and affordable legal services. So when you have a question which may potentially be a question in the legal realm, not all of us, not even all of us who are in the session today can pick up a phone and call a lawyer. But can we get reliable preliminary information and can AI/ML techniques or new methods coming out help in that sphere? Perhaps not replacing lawyers, but being that first line of affordable legal services. And lastly, better insights into the legal system itself. So legal research or data journalism, an understanding of the system that is not purely based on anecdotes or on siloed views, but give us a better picture. So those are some examples, but I also wanted to throw this question back to the panelists and I'll take Rajesh Hazra's question as an example. Where if you could speak to it, some AI that we use today in the justice system, which you see building out and developing further in the years to come.
Yeah, sure. So and then in the sort of, I mean, at the conclusion of all of these conversations, I realized like I sound like such a skeptic, that, oh my God, AI. But I mean, what I was trying to contextualize in my sort of previous session was to situate it within India. But sort of the more positive aspect is what I might cover now is one of the examples that I mentioned was, say, for instance, Suvas. I mean, and these are AI tools that are really, that are accessible in the near future. It is being introduced now. It is going through the training process, and it will be implemented in a manner that can allow for iterations without in a process of, say, re-entrenching social biases, which might happen, say, in other sort of bigger AI tools. So, for instance, even if you look at Singapore, they have real-time translation and transcription of their services. I mean, of court proceedings, for instance. Otherwise, in Singapore, what would happen is an individual, if they wanted the transcript the same day, they would have to get a private individual to come, pay them, and then do it the same day and then get it signed. If they wanted it, say, in arbitrations. But now what the courts have started doing is they've started doing it real-time themselves. So they're eliminating the process of like having external people, and this is something that is a part of justice delivery, providing like real-time orders. So otherwise in courts, you have to file for an inspection or you have to file for an order, and then the court gives you that order. By the time it goes to another person, there is like more time. So I think these are accessible tools. A way to think about easy solutions would be to, one, identify in terms of administrative efficiency. So there are a lot of tools that can just increase administrative efficiency, right? You can automate daily processes, create cause lists that are automatic. You can have scheduling tools which can be optimized. And all of them have like with any technology, they need to be iterative. You need to have a very good feedback loop that needs to make it better, needs to address, some of the complexities that the first, beta version might not be able to do. So one is improving administrative efficiency. The other aspect of administrative efficiency with AI is also just like re-engineering processes. They can't be piecemeal solutions that you're like, oh, this is the new tool, please use. They have to re-engineer processes, and that is also something that I think is an accessible AI solution for today. The other sort of bunch, which is not, not administrative efficiency, is maybe computational tools. Computational tools, which is where you use a lot of jurisprudence. Say, for instance, in Brazil, there's a tool called Victor, which goes through a large set of large data set and then identifies whether a case needs to fall under a particular category. For instance, in the Supreme Court, all cases that are going for the Supreme Court, apart from appeals, of course, need to have a substantial question of law. So there is an equivalent in Brazil that needs to be classified. And earlier, civil servants were doing this. But now, with the use of the tool Victor, it can now be done like in an automated fashion. That is not to say that this doesn't come with complexities, right? I mean, this is something that's possible, but there are a lot of challenges, and there's a lot of criticism of how Victor has been used as well, and all of that needs to be sort of addressed. But in, say, maybe the midterm, like mid-long term, these are tools that can be used. The sort of easier and I think very litigant-friendly tool are, using legal robotics in some very small fashion. So, for instance, if you want to file, an FIR, or if you want to file a check bouncing case, then if a tool can sort of help you navigate, a bot can help you navigate the process, it might make just receiving information to, the layperson so much easier. I mean, it is essentially diversifying knowledge, diversifying legal knowledge. And I think there are clear benefits that can sort of accrue. And these are, I think, some of the solutions I think that can be implemented in maybe a stratified form. But to address the question, are they things that can be implemented without the large degree of skepticism that I was maybe showcasing earlier? They are, but I would still say that, we have to think about them in a stratified manner in terms of like progression, as opposed to like adoption of everything that looks and feels cool.
Thank you, Vaidehi. The next set of questions is around AI techniques. So what kind of work do you see happening in this space? And I'll take Abhishek Nevatia's question as an example, and perhaps Vivek, you could address this, and Devendra, if you have any thoughts as well, which is beyond first order pattern recognition and classification, which aim to solve procedural issues. Do we see deep learning impacting substantive concepts such as equity and justice? In other words, can we write a programming language for the law that interfaces more effectively with data processing algorithms? You're on mute.
Yeah, so thank you for the question. I think, and maybe I'm nitpicking a little bit here, but in general, the whole point with AI is you don't have to program it, but that's, so the intent actually here is actually the patterns are emergent from the data. And that's really the core of what AI is. But I think that I think that, that I definitely believe when you see the kinds of things that people can do with AI, I think that you certainly could do things. I mean, now you can say that these are maybe they're not first order pattern recognition, but they are pattern recognition sophisticated. Now let's just take an example. Let's say that I have a bunch of documents that are, the source documents related to a case, and I want to pass that in. And I'm not saying there exists a tool that does it today. But I think that there could be a tool that did it today that say, okay, I want to now understand a timeline of all the things that happened in that case. So it just actually automatically create that. Okay, and now or let me say that I want to know. Let's say you want to understand. For example, let me take a. There is obviously a question where you can answer questions with respect to things, but let me twist it in an interesting way. Supposing you get a scenario that you want to actually there is a case which maybe is running for many years. There's lots of entities, a lot of people involved. When you refer to a particular entity and you get a summary of what the relationship of that entity is to that case. Okay, I mean, just to think about it. Let's say I'm in the middle of actually litigating a case, and I'm saying, okay, this person comes up. Then in what ways is that person or that entity related to what's going on in this case? Now that's an example of something that I think can be done. I mean, I don't see anything that is doing it today. So it's like context-specific summarization. So summarization is actually a problem that we're solving. I think that, for example, while this is just I think one way that one thing that could happen is, of course, given a particular case, how can I understand what aspects of the law? I know this may be something that a citizen, you're trying to explain your situation in a kind of a lay language, and then they say, okay, this is really the substantive law that you need to deal with, and this is how you should proceed with this. Some kind of a initial advice kind of a tool, which could be that's something again which goes to citizens, and citizens are saying, I have this thing, and what should I do? I don't know what to do, and actually it actually you understand that entire thing. Or there may be more important things like, given a case, how to understand what are things that are similar to it, right? That's a similarity kind of a kind of a thing which is something that somebody could do. I also think that most of us use Gmail or something like that. When as you type, it gives you suggestions on what to complete. Maybe an auto completion for where you're actually not just completing a few words. Maybe you're and you say, okay, does this make sense for as you create something? So and all of these are actually steps, which there is a continuum. It's not, you don't have to get to and you can certainly go to a case where, okay, you actually kind of either predict or actually create a judgment, but that the standard is much higher for that. Because, and this is a fact that, and this is a fact in every area of AI. Let me take an example of, let's say, what's it called, self-driving cars, right? In the case of self-driving cars, today, there are so many accidents that happen every day with humans driving. But if a self-driving car has an accident, that's a big deal. And it should be, right? But so therefore, the bar is much higher. So therefore, the intent is, so the same thing when you actually get to a scenario where you, so therefore, if you do a big thing using something like AI, then even you go wrong once, the issue is going to be it's going to actually be a very, so therefore you have to actually have this kind of a scenario where you're actually doing little things and actually with human this thing where the intent is actually to improve productivity. And that's why are we looking at AI in justice in the first place? We are doing it because there is all this pendency, there's all these things, and we need to make processes more efficient. By the way, to do that, there are lots of things, and I think Vaidehi had referred to it, lots of things short of what we will call AI today, which are actually being used to do those things, and which are actually where there is a low-hanging fruit, which actually can give us a lot of benefit without going to deep learning and other things that are there. And there are ways that where this deep learning can actually be used in kind of ways that are a kind of that take things in small chunks and actually help you do smart things without actually taking massive leaps. Where I think trust is a massive issue. Even if I don't even think the technology is ready today, but even if it were. There is the trust gap that has to be filled.
Absolutely. Pulkit, do you have something to add?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think Vivek mentioned some really great points. I'll again sort of approach it from an engineer and an industry point of view, right? I remember, I think somebody mentioned earlier that the current data sets available in legal are more with regards to judgments and orders, and filings and petitions are not available, right? While that is true at the national level or at the public level, that is not true for large organizations, right? So a couple of things to note here. Number one, government or government organizations are among the topmost litigators in the country, right? And there are fair number of private organizations or publicly listed organizations which have a large amount of litigation exposure in the country. A lot of what these people are yearning for is the ability to tap into the organizational memory, right? And not keep reinventing the same wheel over and over again, right? So, for example, a government department, if communication gets managed to happen, right? And that is a big ask for large organizations, for communication to happen. But if communication happens, there is no tapping into the organizational memory of what has happened in the last 20 years in the organization, right? And forget about looking at national data sets and national filings and national petitions. If a city development authority who does most of their cases are, let's say, land acquisition and real estate development, the 100,000 or 500,000 cases that have gone through their system in the last 10 years are narrow enough where there is an opportunity for pattern recognition to match it and answer a lot of the questions that Vivek thought or thinks that should be answerable within the context of that organization. And then that in itself unlocks a lot of value, not just for that organization, but also on the overall pressure against the justice system, right? If everybody starts doing it, suddenly a lot of pressure gets alleviated, right? वो pressure cooker का सीटी ऊपर से निकाल दिया basically, right? So that is what I wanted to add to, and Vivek, really appreciate you made some really amazing points.
Thank you, Pulkit. Devendra?
So I just want to, this is an excellent summary, and there are, I want to build on the 2-3 things that Vivek said and a few that Pulkit said. And I want to sort of bring it back to the question that you posed, which is on what would the impact of this be on equity and justice. So first of all, let's look at the use of deep learning for something like this. What these massive complicated models actually allow you to do goes well beyond just pattern recognition. They allow you to also learn, or rather allows the model to learn relationships between different parts of the text. And that is something, it sounds easy for a human to do that, okay, this is a sentence that links to the other, but conceptually for something that doesn't have any understanding of what a language is, it's a complicated process and it's computationally really difficult to do. But now let's take that as a given that we can do that with a reasonable amount of accuracy. Then you see the application to examining justice and equity is obvious, because if you take 2 cases where you have substantially similar facts of the case, you have substantially similar arguments, and you find that the rulings on them are different. All of this established because you have an algorithm which can understand what the grounds are, what the relevant arguments to those grounds are, and what the rulings relevant to those arguments are. Then right there you have a monitoring system for equity. So I wouldn't really dismiss it offhand, because it's not a simple pattern recognition system. The second thing I want to draw attention to, and this is what Vivek and Pulkit pointed out, and this is extremely important. We have to stop thinking of all of these machine learning tools as only being deep learning. So this is not, there is a whole wide array of tools that fall in between, which go from, I mean, if you look at the most basic pattern matching, which has been available since the 60s, since Unix was created, right up to the massive models that you have OpenGPT-3 and BERT transformers, there is a whole range of things in between. One thing is what Pulkit referred to, which are regression-based models. Depending on what problem you're trying to tackle, one of these can actually work. And your choice of the tool has to depend on the specifications of your problem. So the first one would be criticality, on how much error can you afford to make in this. The second is the variability. What kind of variation do you see in your data that your model is expected to handle? And then, I mean, the other ones relate to output and what kind of output you're trying to get. So if you want to get a summary, then maybe you will try something else. If you want to do just classification, you might use something else. The point is, once you sort of decide what these inputs are going to be, a fairly simple model can give you great results. So we shouldn't even diss that task, where there is no need to disrespect that simple task of classification. It can be really useful. So in my experience, for instance, in my work on tax litigation, the simple task of classifying a case in 5 different types of buckets is really useful, because that gives the tax department or the researcher insights on, okay, what kinds of cases are typically getting appealed and how many of them is the department losing. So now, do we have to think differently about how the government looks at this litigation? This doesn't need a massive deep learning model. It's a simple classification task, but the insights you get out of it and what you can do with it are significant. So those are the 2 things I wanted to point to.
Thank you,
Oh, and
David.
just
Right.
one last one, which I skipped. And this is where deep learning can be really useful and can have an impact. And this is drawing on what I've heard from all three people today. I can think of employing deep learning models for document generation. So where you don't have a complicated document, either in the form of a petition or in the form of an order. In fact, if the variables that you have to play with and the variations within them on what forms they can take is not really big, like in motor accident cases or with IPR cases, then some of this document generation could actually be automated. I can see some possibility for that. I don't know that there exist tools for that, but I can see that deep learning can have an impact over there.
Yeah, I think, and there's a couple of more comments on the chat and questions which relate well to this. Abhishek, for example, was asking that, natural language can be wonky. So for those deep learning techniques to come in, how would you identify the obiter of a judgment to the rationale, to the facts? And I wanted to mention here that that's one of the efforts of the OpenAI mission, which is that we have law students all over the country volunteering to annotate judgments, and that being available as open data sets, so that with a large enough data set, you then have benchmarking that you can do against algorithms who try and perform the same functions. But that is part of the kind of effort that has to be done in building that infrastructure. So the kinds of examples Devendra's talking about can become possible after that, and all those really cool deep learning applications as well. I see a set of questions around the impact for the legal profession. And it was interesting that a couple of questions were kind of going at the same thing from slightly different perspectives. So Pulkit, I'll ask you to come in on this. One was from a question from Arpit, who talks about, hopefully in the future, we'll have lower courts and high court filings available online. According to you, Pulkit, what are the tools you think ProVakil and other firms in your space can offer to the legal profession? And as a flip side to this is a slightly more skeptical take on this from Sharik, who says, don't you think AI as a word is used heedlessly without its actual use cases being realized by the legal industry? And can you suggest one function where AI can actually provide value to lawyers or consumers in legal tech? So kind of two sides of the same coin. So would love to hear your thoughts on that.
I'm sort of trying to think if there can be additional answers, because both of these questions have somewhat already been answered in the discussion today. The first part in terms of filings, right? Two things that Devendra mentioned in terms of document generation, right? And in implementing these systems, you will start to address it by the simplest task first, right? So working your way upwards from the bottom of the pyramid. And so for that, for example, the MACT is a very good candidate for that, right? Because these are similar type of matters, document generation, even passing orders, right? If you can constrain the output of, and it can need not be a 100% automated system, right? It could be a 65-70% automation, and the system flags the rest 30% that, okay, this requires human intervention, right? So those sort of systems definitely make a lot of sense. You preface the question with what can ProVakil offer. I would sort of change the question to what can ProVakil build on top of it, right? And building on top of it lends itself to unlocking a lot of value for people who have a lot of dependency onto the system, right? So for example, insurance companies, banks, right? All of these companies which deal with these systems, suddenly you unlock a lot of value for even those players, right? By building on top of the system. Then this is one thing that I sort of have tried to emphasize today, that progress will not happen just from one stakeholder itself. The system will need to take care of all these stakeholders and take them together, right? Because everybody is sort of interacting with the system in some way. The second part of your question, where you, I think it was what deep learning can happen in legal tech. And I'll again sort of draw back to the example that I gave. That was an example of image matching, where the registry is publishing 10,000 marks on a weekly basis, and you're matching it against images, right? That is some, that is an example of a machine understanding images and then comparing it to a wide array of other images to figure out if the entities are similar or the shapes and so on and so forth, right? So it's not a straightforward text or a variable matching problem, right? So
Thank you, Pulkit. Vivek?
Yes, I just wanted to, and I think that when Pulkit raised MACT, I think a lot of interesting things are actually happening in MACT, and I think I think the Delhi High Court is actually doing some interesting things there, and including doing a number of things, none of which are being, but can have impact in how soon of things are resolved. So an example is that they're actually they're integrating a number of different databases. They're integrating with the Sarathi database, which is the database of all the all the driver's licenses in the country. They're integrating with the Vahan database, so you can understand the insurance status of the vehicle right from the beginning. They actually have these systems, and I think these systems where basically when these are being piloted, and there are basically softwares where you can actually the investigating officer can go and basically collect a bunch of video evidence on the field, which then becomes directly part of the system. So therefore, and which kind of, rather than in having these obtuse descriptions of what happened, you can actually take video evidence of what exactly happened in the accident. There is also the information from the hospitals and all of those things related to basically what was the nature of the injuries and all those kinds of things. And the intent is really to try and see that within like 10 days of the accident, that award can be given. Now that is a dramatic thing that if you can achieve, and I as someone who knows this, it's somewhat from not directly involved myself, but I know what's going on here. I think this is achievable. All these connections are there, and if you actually can take a relatively kind of simple case and actually make sure payments happen on time to people when they really need it, that would be a dramatic, and MACT is one of the big massive things where if you look at a large number of cases fall into this. And so that's an example of what everybody's saying. Not necessarily some magical AI is going on in there, but actually the impact of what might happen if you actually had a system where you could make a decision that fast because you're connected to everything, and lots of it is basically companies just kind of is right now. That's so just wanted to like that. Thanks Pulkit for bringing up MACT.
Thank you, Vivek. There's a question from Rajesh, which I think I'll open to any of the panelists. How can the legal professionals contribute to making data systems for deep learning, or really contribute to any of the themes that we might have mentioned today?
So, I mean, let me take a cut at it. I mean, others may have different views and things like that. As I said, one of the things about we want to create. I think that when you have, in the end, legal professionals are the people who are using the systems. And I think one of the things about learning is actually, as you use it, there is the capability of actually, through the act of using. I mean, just as an example, today, if I look at how do you think Google gets so smart at doing things? Because we use it, okay? And their software is clever enough to understand based upon what information we are giving them. So now, of course, that's a goal that we are far away from. But in the end, things will actually work when it becomes that simple, right? That when I use it, the system is learning. Now, there are certain areas where this is simpler than others, but in the end, in the areas where progress is the fastest, this is one of the important characteristics of how things happen. So let me just take a little bit of a tech view and say that and let others.
Devendra, did you have a less tech view on this?
I have limited input sort of view on this. One is learn to code. It's always useful because the thing is, bridging this divide is really difficult because you have one very technical field which is law and the other very technical field which is computer engineering, and you really need some people who can talk to both sides. So if there are some lawyers who are enthusiastic about learning to code, I'd say please do it. It's immensely useful. And the second, this is not for lawyers really, but generally for all of us to think about is how we can involve lawyers to in creating more data sets. What Vivek is doing right now, as a matter of fact. I'm sort of reminded of. So in a past life, I used to be a biotechnologist, and we had this beautiful program about, I would say, 8 to 10 years ago called Foldit. And what Foldit did is it was a game on the face of it, but what you did there is you tried some trial and error to fold proteins. Folding proteins in a particular way is what gives them their function. So what this did was it turned it into a game, and anybody who's not even trained could try things where you didn't really have to know how beta sheets and alpha folds work, but you tried things and stuff worked. And then that became the route for more research. So I'm thinking of some game like that where you throw it to people and they can do some annotation on their own time, where they get some digital credits to do something with, like Google does. You get some points for giving reviews. On Reddit, you get some Reddit gold so that you can do some things that other people can't. But that's something to think about, gamifying the data creation process.
Yeah, I'd love to create or participate in something like that as well. Vaidehi?
Yeah, I mean, I had just a very simple point, and I think this occurs with every time there's something new. It's the fear of it being the enemy, really. And I think like that is something that, I mean, going with that predisposition is never going to lead us on the bright side of things, right? And I think once we sort of take a step back and then don't go in with this is our enemy and going to take our jobs away, then we can find ways in which Vivek was talking, which is to use it. So what are the ways in which, I mean, AI can help make my life easier? Like, for instance, Pulkit was talking about how you simply don't have to sit and go through those registers on trademarks, on every Monday morning. You can use that to develop other skills, maybe like the one that Devendra was talking about, right? It gives us space to do new things. But if we are stuck in the rut of wanting to continue doing the same things that we are doing, and that is the only way in which we think the legal profession needs to move forward, then I think that is a stagnation. Only if there is like the want to keep developing not only new skill sets but also expanding the kind of work that we are doing, I think that sort of change in mindset, I think, is the most critical aspect of really absorbing all that AI really can do to help us.
Thank you. Pulkit, did you have something to add?
Yeah, so I have two points. They were addressed in a different way. So one thing that I think lawyers can start to appreciate is just to get rid of the fear of technology, right? My grandfather used to tell me the story of when the Indian Railways introduced the automatic ticket booking. It was met with a lot of opposition, right? The hypothesis was that there are so many Vela people in the country who are earning money by standing in those queues to get the tickets done. If you do it automated reservation, the crime rates are going to go up. Like that was the opposition of doing automated ticketing in railways. Today, you can't think about doing it manually, right? Today, you can't think about standing in a queue for getting a ticket. So we have been talking about contribution in the context of labeling data or helping create data. A lot of the students, especially in the audience, are going to be working with large organizations, law firms, or running practices of their own. If you are able to ask this question to yourself as you are going about your lawyering, right? Why can't a system do this for me, right? If you just keep asking this question to yourself, you will find technology enablers out there who will help you and make a system do it for you, right? And that is how, like, step by step, you will get to a place where you reduce a lot of banal and mundane work that is, of course, a part of the legal profession, and focus your energies onto the creative side of things and the lawyering side of things, right? So that, I think, would really differentiate the legal industry leaders of tomorrow in the industry.
Thank you, Pulkit. I think in a way you also answered the last question I was going to pick from this. So I won't bring it to you, but Yashesh asks, it's a broad question. I'll maybe narrow it down slightly, but Yashesh asks, what will be the situation of the Indian legal system in 2030? I'm reminded of that saying of how we massively overestimate what the changes in 5 years and underestimate the changes in 10. But if you were to maybe think of one thing that you think will be measurably different in the justice system or in the legal profession, what would your bet be on that one thing? And it'd be great to go around all the panelists to get their bet on the future, and maybe we can meet back in a decade to see who was on the money the most, in any order. Vaidehi?
Yeah, I can go first. I started on a skeptic note and I'll end it on such. So one of the tools that's really gaining a lot of traction is how decision making can be supplemented through automation processes. For instance, you have all of this case law is going to be processed by this AI tool, and on the basis of that, you're going to get some information, what the precedent might look like, which are the cases it might be similar to. And these tools are, intended to help a judge make better decisions. They're not intended to replace a judge. And I think there is like concurrence on all grounds that is not what we are looking for. But what I want to highlight, though, is the possibility of automation biases that occur in such situations, because judges have such a high workload, and then there is an automatic system which tells you, an automated system which tells you, oh, this is the manner in which you can think about it. There's a possibility for us to take that as an objective solution to the situation. So, supplemental tools that supplement decision-making, that aggregate information, that do analytics, I think these are going to be very prevalent, regardless of how AI, regardless of what the conversation the next 2 years is. Even if there is a lot of skepticism, I think growth is going to continue on that field. And we are going to have like legal analytics all around us, and they are going to be helping judges. So I think that is one thing that's going to be there, but I do want to sort of condition that again, that automation bias is a very real possibility, and that is something that we should also be thinking about.
Thank you, Vaidehi. Vivek?
Yeah, so I think that I'll go first. I will say what I think. I think so. I hope that, and this is more a wish, that I hope that this whole thing about everything being paperless is definitely true by 2030. That basically all our courts are truly digital by 2030. Maybe we can achieve that. That's one thing. The second thing that I do hope that many of these simpler processes, either they get out of they go to things like ODR, or there are kind of standardized mechanisms of dealing with simpler issues, so that the courts are dealing with the more complex issues. I think that I do want to comment on automation bias. Automation bias is something that is real, but I think that when and it is real and it does exist. But I think that there is another kind of bias, which is in the minds of humans, which is actually much harder to remove than bias in the minds of AI systems. So therefore, I'd like to put the counterpoint on, because in the end, all judgments and everything are actually done by people, and which are with their inherent biases.
Thank you, Vivek. Pulkit? Oh, sorry, Devendra next.
Sure. Prediction, where will we be in 2030? I think at least at the rate we are going, and again, knowing fully well the problems with the short-term and long-term predictability of such things, I think we can expect a recommendation system on whether you should go fight a case and what it's going to be like if you go do it in place. So an app where you can put in, oh, somebody hit me with a car and this is what happened. Now what should I do after this? A recommendation system of that level I can imagine being available by 2030. And then you could maybe imagine something analogous on the government side, on the winnability of something, or the trial, on whether something should be taken up for trial, or should you just tell people to go solve it themselves? You don't want to burden the court with it, things like that. So the recommendation systems on whether you should go to court and what you should do given a certain situation, those I can imagine being there. Being optimistic.
As a 1 decade later picture, it is a very pragmatic view for sure. Pulkit.
So whenever we talk about these things, I'm always reminded of this quote, the future is already here. It is just unevenly distributed, right? And legal has been slow to adopt tech, not just in India, but globally. It's a tech-averse industry. And over the last at least 5-10 years, the world is waking up to adopting technology. When I say the future is already here, it's just unevenly distributed. It is true, right? I mean, I don't think I have a new insight to add about 2030, but you have recommender systems in Netflix, right? If you like Pulp Fiction, here are 10 other movies you might like. The fundamental problem statements are similar, if more complex, but on a 10-year horizon, absolutely those kind of things are going to happen, right? Automated adjudication for people on food delivery apps. If you ever try their customer service, you click, and suddenly a 200 rupee refund comes to you. There is no person sitting there. That's a model taking the decision whether you are a trustworthy person worthy of that refund or not, right? So those sort of things are already happening. It's just not happening at scale in this industry. And so on a 10-year horizon, if I were to bet, for sure, these kind of things seem in the realm of possibility on that horizon, right? So.
Thank you, all panelists.
To sort of add to that, you could also imagine a Netflix-like recommender system for lawyers. So I have this problem. Should I go to iLawyer? I don't think the legal community will take kindly to it, but I can see that.
We'll just litigate it out of existence is what will happen there. But those are it's not the technology that's the barrier for sure. But thank you for a great panel discussion. I think there was a lot of interesting mix of perspectives and some completely new ways of looking at things as well. And thank you to the audience for your great set of questions and for being with us this evening. Look out for the information on session 2. We hope to see many of you there. And this is me saying good evening and thank you.